Hi, Judge Andrew Napolitano here, and you are on Freedom Watch with my guest this week, former President Obama's State Department spokesperson Marie Harf, and my dear friend and good colleague at Fox News. So, Marie, we often hear our dear president refer to his counterpart in Moscow as his partner. And just this week, President Trump received a phone call from President Putin thanking him for alerting Russia to a planned terror attack in St. Petersburg that our CIA supposedly uncovered. Question for you. Is President Trump being naive in thinking of Vladimir Putin as his partner and friend?
Well, I think that he is a little bit, and thank you for having me on to talk about this topic because it's so important to American foreign policy. You know, President Trump, since he started running for office several years ago, has been very willing to say nice things about Vladimir Putin. And I think a lot of us who've worked in foreign policy, Republicans and Democrats, have always been sort of concerned about that because Vladimir Putin is not a friend of the United States. He pursues what is in his interest, what is in his country's interest, and he does not stand up for things that are really fundamental to the American system, whether that's democracy or human rights or freedom of the press. So I think that President Trump is a little bit naive to think that just because President Putin says nice things about him, that somehow he's our friend or can be trusted. All we have to do is look at the last year and the actions that President Putin directed the Russian government to do in terms of meddling in our election to know that he's not a friend of America.
This October, I was in Switzerland and met with a number of government officials. There is no president of Switzerland. There's a council of 7, and they're part-time. Imagine that, part-time. The 7 of them choose an 8th, and the 8th is full-time. He's more or less the chief operating officer of the government. I had lunch with this person they call the 8th, a former diplomat and ambassador, now the chief operating officer of the Swiss government. He looked at me and he said, "Who do you think the most dangerous person in the world is right now?" This is 2 months ago. I said, "Wow. Kim Jong-un?" He said, "No, Vladimir Putin." And I said to him, "How do you know that?" He said, "I have negotiated directly with Vladimir Putin, and I have looked in his eyes. I think he would kill anyone to get ahead." Do you agree with that assessment?
Wow, that's a stunning conversation. And I'm not sure I would say he's the most dangerous person in the world, but he is definitely dangerous. And he has led a government that has had a role or played a hand in many shady ways in getting rid of dissidents, in jailing journalists, even killing dissidents and journalists who don't agree with the regime in Moscow. He's also invaded countries. We can talk about Georgia. We can talk about Crimea. We can talk about Ukraine. He has led a crackdown on rights, on democracy in Russia, and he has meddled in other countries. So I really do think that where there are places we can work with Russia, we should. My administration did, and we were actually criticized for it by a lot of Republicans. But the colleague that you spoke to about the threat that Putin poses is saying something that a lot of people in Europe are feeling, and they're worried that President Trump doesn't feel the same sense of urgency about the threat that Putin plays.
Does the president have people around him, General McMaster, General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, who see the real danger of Vladimir Putin? And if they do they tell him this, or are they just telling him what they think he wants to hear?
Well, I think he does now. You know, one of the most concerning things for a lot of people was Mike Flynn, not just because of his shady business dealings, but because he was someone who seemed to feel affinity for Vladimir Putin. And when he was made National Security Advisor, a lot of us were worried that's what President Trump was going to be hearing.
Right.
I think that General McMaster does and Secretary Mattis. Read the national security strategy that the administration released this week. It talks about the threat that Russia poses. Now, that is a very different message than President Trump has said publicly, but I think it underscores that the foreign policy experts in the administration understand the problem that Russia poses for the United States, for our allies, for our interests. Just look at a country like Syria. These guys know that Russia is playing a very destabilizing role, And I hope President Trump listens to them. I don't know what people are telling him behind the scenes. I would love to be a fly on that wall.
Marie, we only have about 15 seconds left. Does Vladimir Putin want to return Russia to the size of the former Soviet Union?
I think he wants Russia to return to that glory. Maybe not have every amount of territory they had, but he's a former KGB guy, and that dies hard. And he wants Russia to retain its power as a global power, that status. That's absolutely what he's trying to do.
Marie Harf, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas, my friend.
I'll see you in a couple
Have a
weeks.
wonderful holiday.
Thank you. From New York, defending freedom whenever they let me, Judge Andrew Napolitano here. See you next time, America.